So welcome to our latest question and answer session. Hope everyone is doing well, staying safe. So some good questions this week, and here are the few answers to them. So these two questions dealt with kind of different sides of the same coin. The first was a question on Clinton's political ads and whether they were successful, in particular whether he made the same effort in his reelection campaign. And then in that second question, in that reelection campaign, um, what were some of the specifics of the of the Clinton fundraising scandal? And there is something of a pattern here. I mean, if you think back to '72 with Nixon and Watergate, one of the ironies of Watergate is that Nixon spends so much effort undermining democracy and trying to weaken the Democrats in an election that he was basically guaranteed to win anyway, absent some kind of cataclysmic event. And similarly, Clinton in 1996, there was almost no way that he was going to lose. The Dole campaign was, it didn't have a lot of energy. Perot was draining votes from right-wing populists away from Dole. Clinton led throughout the campaign by 15 or 20 points. And yet he was obsessed with the idea of running lots and lots of ads that he thought would be effective. And to run lots and lots of ads, he needed to raise lots and lots of money. And he did so in ways that were at least unethical and borderline illegal. And two of the highest profile events, the first was was his decision. And again, Clinton is not the most ethical president we've had in American history, to welcome overnight visitors to the Lincoln bedroom in the White House. This very prestigious position. You get to sleep a night in the White House, then have breakfast with the president and the first family in the morning. But he basically sold access to the Lincoln bedroom. His excuse was that he was just allowing friends to come and sleep in the White House, as often had been done by previous presidents. Where Clinton changes this is that these friends also give his campaign lots of money in the aftermath. It's pretty much a cash for access deal, but because they could never prove it, it just seems unseemly rather than anything else. This is one of the ironies, is that Clinton always skates right up to the line of breaking the law on campaign finance, but never over. The one in the administration who runs into the most problem in this regard is Al Gore. Um, the Chinese American community very aggressively raised funds for Clinton in 1996, but there were allegations that some of this money came from Chinese, not Chinese American sources, and it is illegal under federal law for foreign nationals to make individual donations to an American presidential campaign. And one of those events occurred in, of all places, a Buddhist temple. And Clinton sent Gore out to do the dirty work of raising the money. Gore's subsequent explanation is that he didn't realize that this was a fundraising event because it was in a temple. I mean, where did he think the money was coming from? And this became a scandal that would hover over Gore's career into 2000. The sense was that Clinton's tarnishes slid off on Gore as well. As we see when we get to the 2000 election, Gore felt a need to break with Clinton on ethics issues that probably wound up hurting him in the 2000 campaign. So yes, Clinton devoted a lot of effort to ads in '96, and his activities in this regard, at the very least, came right up to the line of unethical conduct. Second question on elaborate a little more on Hillary's performance when she was put in charge of the healthcare plan, and then why the American public had such a negative reaction against healthcare improvements during the Clinton years. When, and this is absolutely true, you see wealthy countries in Europe who are much more social democratic, progressive on healthcare. The problem that Hillary has with regards to healthcare is twofold. Um, One was solvable and one was not. The solvable problem is that she was not an office holder herself. And so you had this unwieldy situation where the first lady, a person who could not be fired because the president is not going to fire the first lady, um, who sometimes seemed to be speaking for the president, but oftentimes was not. So she was neither independent of the White House nor dependent on the White House. It was a reminder that the first lady, or eventually the first husband, should not be put in a policy-making role, because there's an inherent conflict of interest. The problem that Hillary, so that was the solvable program, basically do the Clinton plan but put someone else in charge. The unsolvable problem was that, the American healthcare system, think back to right when we started the course, it has this weird environment in the 1940s where it becomes tied to jobs. So Hillary, in her plan, the goal was to create a national health insurance plan that would be administered by these things called health maintenance alliances, what we now call HMOs, basically large insurance conglomerates, who could, because they were so large, negotiate with hospitals at cost and in theory lower the price of medical care. And on paper, it was by no means a crazy idea. It was a perfectly reasonable idea. The the problem with it is that Hillary, in her remarks, emphasized the millions of Americans who lacked health care. But there were far more Americans who had health care through their jobs, and in some cases, indeed maybe in most cases, were happy with the health care that they had, or at the very least were not so unhappy with the health care that they had that they were willing to risk losing that insurance and have it be replaced by a government program that was, if nothing else, incredibly complicated, and not particularly easy for the layperson to understand. And here is where Hillary would have been far better served by bringing in Democratic members of Congress who seem to have a better sense of how public attitudes towards healthcare were. But in the end, she doesn't take that approach, and that winds up costing her. Next question. So, I think as an overall, record, she does not get high marks for her handling of the healthcare proposal in 93, 94. Next question, on clarifying the bombing of the federal buildings, Oklahoma City bombing in 95. What do you mean when you state that whether the anti-government sentiment contributed to an intellectual atmosphere? This is a good question. The early 1990s are a weird period in American history intellectually, in that there is a very powerful far-right anti-government environment associated and the Oklahoma City bombing is the third of three events here. The first was this just horrific event in Waco, Texas, where there was this religious cult called the Branch Davidians, who were engaged in violations of a variety of laws, especially gun laws. They'd accumulated all kinds of guns on the property. The FBI obtains a warrant to arrest the head of the Branch Davidians, this guy named David Koresh. And Koresh responds with his followers by taking out their guns and shooting at the FBI agents. And the result is the FBI surrounds the complex. And this goes on for several days. And there are several dozen of these Branch Davidians in the complex, including children. Eventually, Attorney General Reno authorizes a raid on the complex. She's worried, not without reason, that Koresh may do this kind of murder-suicide approach. But the result is this bombing. Some of the Branch Davidians, including Koresh, but also including some of the kids, are killed. And there's this question of whether the government went too far. Similarly, there was another Lauren, and I think in retrospect, I mean, this may not have been the most pristinely planned operation, but in the end, the responsibility for it lay entirely with Koresh. Similar approach in this thing called Ruby Ridge, Idaho, where there's an FBI. There's this militia group. Militias in the 1990s were these far right groups that did not accept the authority of the U.S. government. Again, there were violations of gun laws and other laws. They're surrounded by the FBI, and one of the militia leaders is killed. And this is seen as proving on the far right that the U.S. government is tyrannical. These are groups that I think are best labeled domestic terrorists. I mean, they're on the very far right. They're engaged in violence. They do not accept the authority of the government. But in the '94 election, there's a lot of rhetoric from some of the far right candidates that are recruited to run by Gingrich that that don't really that do not advocate violence, but that are very, very harshly anti-government, and the line between this far right militia fringe and the most extreme of the Republican candidates in 1994 is not always a clear line. In the aftermath of Oklahoma City, Clinton, who is, if nothing else, a very savvy politician, takes advantage of this and basically raises the argument that, look, these far right members of Congress, by their attacks on the federal government, have helped sustain these far right militia activists, and therefore share some of the blame for their activity. Now, the ultra-conservative Republican congressman vehemently denied these claims. They said that they were unfair, and by and large they were. But politically, it's a potent attack because the rhetoric from the far right of the Republican caucus in '94 and '95 is so extreme. Next question, which in some ways is the same question, although we're dealing with three different areas. Curious to know what Clinton's views were on social welfare programs. Why was Clinton so against gay rights? And why was it more politically useful for the Republicans to shift further to the right than for the Democrats to shift further to the left? The core question here is the middle one, and the answer to that question is this chart. So Gallup, which is a polling company, has asked Americans every year since the early '90s, do you consider yourself conservative, moderate, or liberal? And one of the things you can see on this chart is that the number of people who consider themselves liberal has risen by a fairly significant margin between '92 and 2018. And the number of people who consider themselves moderate has dropped, which I think one of the reasons why we're in such a polarized environment. But the one thing you can see from this chart is that if you're an unapologetic liberal, for most of the 1990s, you have fewer than 1/5 of the country in your corner. To win, you have to be able to appeal to moderates, and not just to any moderates. You have to be able to appeal to lots of moderates. By contrast, around 2/5 of the country consider themselves conservative until very recently. And so for conservatives, they need to get far fewer moderates to win than liberals do. So politically, the balance between liberals and conservatives, again, until very recently, is not an even battle. So liberals have to move more to the center to win than do conservatives. And two examples of this, I think, were welfare and gay rights. After the Republicans take control of Congress in 1994, remember I showed that clip in one of the snippets where Clinton says the era of big government is over. And one of the changes that he makes is to abandon the idea that welfare that there's a federal guarantee of welfare to people who are poor. And instead, in a major welfare law, which was passed in 1996, basically with Republican votes, but signed by Clinton, the law transforms welfare into a block grant program. The federal government gives a certain amount of dollars to the states just in a grant based on population and based on poverty rates, and the states can then spend the money as they see fit, which includes imposing limits on welfare. So they can have requirements where people aren't allowed to stay on welfare for more than 3 months or 6 months. If they're on welfare, they have to be required to show that they're looking for a job. All kinds of these restrictions that previously had not been present. And Clinton signs this in large part because he wants to be seen as more moderate. It's not entirely clear what his personal position on welfare was. It may indeed be the case that he concluded that this policy was bureaucratically the wiser policy, but the politics here were obvious. Ditto, and even more extreme on gay rights. I suspect that Clinton privately was a strong supporter of gay rights, but he concluded not entirely without reason, in the mid-1990s, that the people who cared about gay rights, who were supportive of it, were going to vote for the Democrats anyway. Whereas people who were opposed to gay rights, especially religious conservatives who might have been moderate in other areas, were that this was a kind of hot button issue for them. And if he positioned himself as anti-gay rights, then maybe he would be able to get their votes. So in a way, you can make an argument that Clinton was, he's sort of the ultimate hypocrite on this. He's someone who feels one thing, who takes the exact opposite position, on a pretty important political and social issue, solely to serve his political agenda. But in the 1990s, a bare majority of Americans oppose gays and lesbians serving openly in the military. Significant majorities of Americans, around a 2-to-1 margin, oppose gay or lesbian couples being allowed to marry. Majority of Americans oppose gay or lesbian couples being allowed to adopt. And so Clinton here is following public opinion rather than leading it. Interesting question here. Why did the southern states vote for Clinton, and what do you think it would take for those states to vote for a Democrat ever again? So here's the map from 1996. The blue states go for Clinton. The red states go for Bob Dole. And if you look, one of the really interesting things you see here in the South is that there's a kind of there's almost like a 4-part shift. So there's within the South itself, we have the Appalachian states, so West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana. And Clinton carries all of those states. Then we have these more deep South states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and then the mid-Atlantic states, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, with Florida and Texas as, sort of on their own. What will it take for a Democrat ever again to carry West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana? They'll have to change the Republican Party. One of the ironies here is that these states have become not just Republican states, but overwhelmingly Republican state, this Appalachian part of the country. And so it's a testament really to Clinton's political talent that he was able to hold these states in the Democratic column in 1996. Gore loses all of them in 2000, and a Democrat will not win any of these states again. Obama loses them in 2008 and 2012, and Hillary gets creamed in them in 2016. The Deep South, Mississippi and Alabama, are likewise strongly Republican. The irony here is that some of these states that Clinton lost, the southern states, Virginia, which now is really a Democratic state, Georgia and North Carolina, those are the states the Democrats in 2020 have the best chance of winning. And the reason here is in part demographic change, that Northerners have moved into these states, and so demographically they're different. And second, and perhaps the more important change, is suburbanization. So the Atlanta suburbs, the Charlotte suburbs, the Washington, D.C. suburbs have exploded in the last 20 years, and southern suburbs tend to be socially moderate and economically in the middle of the road, and these are areas where Trump in particular is extremely weak, and the Democrats have really picked up steam. So one of the things to look forward to in 2020 is whether the Biden campaign really does any sort of investment in Georgia, which was a state that didn't really seem doable for Democrats for many years after Clinton, but this time around is likely to be very close. And then the last question for this week's Q&A video: did the female senators elected in 1992 have similar careers? And the answer to that is basically no. Again, Moseley Braun only served one term because she had these ethical issues. In the 92 fall campaign, it came out that her mother, who had to go into a nursing home, that Moseley Braun and her siblings had arranged for the mother's wealth to be transferred to them just before the mother went into a nursing home, and so that meant that the mother went in under Medicare rather than having to pay her own money, and this was seen as unseemly, which it was. Then Moseley Braun starts dating her campaign manager, and after she's elected, the campaign manager is a lobbyist and is trying to arrange for for increased Nigerian trade deals. There was an embargo against Nigeria, which is a rather brutal military government in the early 1990s, and Moseley Braun travels to Nigeria to sort of bless this initiative, and it's widely seen as basically her, sacrificing ideals for her personal approach. So she, her campaign largely, her career largely fizzles out. Barbara Boxer, who was elected from California, was a really, really effective congresswoman, especially on defense issues, and is basically an ineffective senator. She never quite lives up to her promise. Patty Murray has been from Washington State, has been a quietly effective senator, sort of an establishmentarian. By far the most important of these Year of the Women senators from '92 was Dianne Feinstein, the most moderate of the Democratic women elected in 1992, someone who has been a key player on appropriations issues, on national security issues, on intelligence issues, on judicial matters. She's a member of the Judiciary Committee, and basically every major public policy issue of the last 12 or 15 years, Feinstein has been a key actor in that area. So I think, even though there's an irony that all of these female senators are elected in the same bunch, their careers wind up developing in very different ways. So that's all we have for the Q&A for this week. Hope everyone is well, staying safe, and I will talk to you soon. Okay, bye-bye.